the king of the Golden Mountain. There was a certain merchant who had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were both young and could not walk, and 2 richly laden ships of his sailed forth to sea with all his property on board. And just as he was expecting to win much money by them, news came that they had gone to the bottom. And now, instead of being a rich man, he was a poor one, and had nothing left but one field outside the town. In order to drive his misfortune a little out of his thoughts, he went out to this field. And as he was walking forwards and backwards in it, a little black mannequin stood suddenly by his side and asked why he was so sad and what he was taking so much to heart. Then said the merchant, "If thou couldst help me, I would willingly tell thee." "Who knows?" replied the black dwarf. "Perhaps I can help thee." Then the merchant told him that all he possessed had gone to the bottom of the sea, and that he had nothing left but this field. "Do not trouble thyself," said the dwarf. "If thou wilt promise to give me the first thing that rubs itself against thy leg when thou art at home again, and to bring it here to this place in 12 years' time, thou shalt have as much money as thou wilt." The merchant thought, "What can that be but my dog?" and did not remember his little boy. So he said yes, gave the black man a written and sealed promise, and went home. When he reached home, his little boy was so delighted that he held by a bench, tottered up to him, and seized him fast by the legs. The father was shocked, for he remembered his promise, and now knew what he had pledged himself to do. As, however, he still found no money in his chest, he thought the dwarf had only been jesting. A month afterwards, he went up to the garret, intending to gather together some old tin and to sell it, and saw a great heap of money lying. Then he was happy again, made purchases, became a greater merchant than before, and felt that this world was well governed. In the meantime, the boy grew tall, and at the same time sharp and clever. But the nearer the 12th year approached, the more anxious grew the merchant, so that his distress might be seen in his face. One day, his son asked what ailed him, but the father would not say. The boy, however, persisted so long that at last he told him that without being aware of what he was doing, he had promised him to a black dwarf and had received much money for doing so. He said likewise that he had set his hand and seal to this, and that now, when 12 years had gone by, he would have to give him up. Then said the son, "Oh, father, do not be uneasy. All will go well. The black man has no power over me." Well, the son had himself blessed by the priest, and when the time came, father and son went together to the field, and the son made a circle and placed himself inside it with his father. Then came the black dwarf and said to the old man, "Hast thou brought with thee that which thou hast promised me?" He was silent, but the son asked, "What dost thou want here?" Then said the black dwarf, "I have to speak with thy father, and not with thee." The son replied, "Thou hast betrayed and misled my father. Give back the writing." "No," said the black dwarf, "I will not give up my rights." They spoke together for a long time after this, but at last they agreed that the son, as he did not belong to the enemy of mankind, nor yet to his father, should seat himself in a small boat, which should lie on water which was flowing away from them, and that the father should push it off with his own foot, and then the son should remain given up to the water. So he took leave of his father, placed himself in a little boat, and the father had to push it off with his own foot. The boat capsized so that the keel was uppermost, and the father believed his son was lost, and went home and mourned for him. The boat, however, did not sink, but floated quietly away, and the boy sat safely inside it, and it floated thus for a long time, until at last it stopped by an unknown shore. Then he landed and saw a beautiful castle before him, and set out to go to it. But when he entered it, he found that it was bewitched. He went through every room, but all were empty, until he reached the last, where a snake lay coiled in a ring. The snake, however, was an enchanted maiden, who rejoiced to see him, and said, "Hast thou come, O my deliverer? I have already waited 12 years for thee. This kingdom is bewitched, and thou must set it free." "How can I do that?" he inquired. "Tonight come 12 black men, covered with chains, who will ask what thou art doing here. Keep silent, give them no answer, and let them do what they will with thee. They will torment thee, beat thee, stab thee. Let everything pass, only do not speak. At 12 o'clock, they must go away again. On the second night, 12 others will come. On the third, 24, who will cut off thy head. But at 12 o'clock, their power will be over. And then, if thou hast endured all, and hast not spoken the slightest word, I shall be released. I will come to thee, and will have in a bottle some of the water of life. I will rub thee with that, and then thou wilt come to life again, and be as healthy as before." Then said he, "I will gladly set thee free." And everything happened just as she had said. The black men could not force a single word from him, and on the third night the snake became a beautiful princess, who came with the water of life and brought him back to life again. So she threw herself into his arms and kissed him, and there was joy and gladness in the whole castle. After this, their marriage was celebrated, and he was king of the Golden Mountain. They lived very happily together, and the queen bore a fine boy. 8 years had already gone by when the king bethought him of his father. His heart was moved, and he wished to visit him. The queen, however, would not let him go away, and said, "I know beforehand that it will cause my unhappiness." But he suffered her to have no rest until she consented. At their parting, she gave him a wishing ring and said, "Take this ring and put it on thy finger, and then thou wilt immediately be transported whithersoever thou wouldst be. Only thou must promise me not to use it in wishing me away from this place and with thy father." That he promised her, put the ring on his finger, and wished himself at home, just outside the town where his father lived. Instantly, he found himself there and made for the town. But when he came to the gate, the sentries would not let him in, because he wore such strange and yet such rich and magnificent clothing. Then he went to a hill where a shepherd was watching his sheep, changed clothes with him, put on his old shepherd's coat, and then entered the town without hindrance. When he came to his father, he made himself known to him, but he did not at all believe that the shepherd was his son, and said he certainly had had a son, but that he was dead long ago. However, as he saw he was a poor, needy shepherd, he would give him something to eat. Then the shepherd said to his parents, "I am verily your son. Do you know of no mark on my body by which you could recognize me?" "Yes," said his mother. "Our son had a raspberry mark under his right arm." He slipped back his shirt, and they saw the raspberry under his right arm, and no longer doubted that he was their son. Then he told them that he was king of the Golden Mountain, and a king's daughter was his wife, and that they had a fine son of 7 years old. Then said the father, "That is certainly not true. It is a fine kind of a king who goes about in a ragged shepherd's coat." On this, the son fell in a passion, and without thinking of his promise, turned his ring round, and wished both his wife and child with him. They were there in a second, but the queen wept, and reproached him, and said that he had broken his word, and had brought misfortune upon her. He said, "I have done it thoughtlessly, and not with evil intention," and tried to calm her, and she pretended to believe this, but she had mischief in her mind. Then he led her out of the town into the field, and showed her the stream where the little boat had been pushed off. And then he said, "I am tired. Sit down. I will sleep a while on thy lap." and he laid his head on her lap and fell asleep. When he was asleep, she first drew the ring from his finger. Then she drew away the foot which was under him, leaving only the slipper behind her. And she took her child in her arms and wished herself back in her own kingdom. When he awoke, there he lay, quite deserted, and his wife and child were gone, and so was the ring from his finger. The slipper only was still there as a token. "Home to thy parents thou canst not return," thought he. "They would say that thou wast a wizard. Thou must be off, and walk on until thou arrivest in thine own kingdom." So he went away, and came at length to a hill by which 3 giants were standing, disputing with each other, because they did not know how to divide their father's property. When they saw him passing by, they called to him and said little men had quick wits, and that he was to divide their inheritance for them. The inheritance, however, consisted of a sword, which had this property, that if anyone took it in his hand and said, "All heads off but mine," every head would lie on the ground. Secondly, of a cloak, which made anyone who put it on invisible. Thirdly, of a pair of boots which could transport the wearer to any place he wished in a moment. He said, "Give me the 3 things that I may see if they are still in good condition." They gave him the cloak, and when he had put it on, he was invisible and changed into a fly. Then he resumed his own form and said, "The cloak is a good one. Now give me the sword." They said, "No, we will not give thee that. If thou were to say, 'All heads off but mine,' all our heads would be off, and thou alone wouldst be left with thine." Nevertheless, they gave it to him with the condition that he was only to try it against a tree. This he did, and the sword cut in two the trunk of a tree, as if it had been a blade of straw. Then he wanted to have the boots likewise, but they said, "No, we will not give them. If thou hadst them on thy feet, and wert to wish thyself at the top of the hill, we should be left down here with nothing." "Oh, no," said he, "I will not do that." So they gave him the boots as well. And now, when he had got all these things, he thought of nothing but his wife and his child, and said as though to himself, "Oh, if I were but on the golden mountain." And at the same moment he vanished from the sight of the giants, and thus their inheritance was divided. When he was near his palace, he heard sounds of joy, and fiddles, and flutes, and the people told him that his wife was celebrating her wedding with another. Then he fell into a rage, and said, "False woman, she betrayed and deserted me whilst I was asleep." So he put on his cloak, and unseen by all went into the palace. When he entered the dining hall, a great table was spread with delicious food, and the guests were eating and drinking and laughing and jesting. She sat on a royal seat in the midst of them in splendid apparel, with a crown on her head. He placed himself behind her, and no one saw him. When she put a piece of meat on a plate for herself, he took it away and ate it. And when she poured out a glass of wine for herself, he took it away and drank it. She was always helping herself to something, and yet she never got anything, for plate and glass disappeared immediately. Then, dismayed and ashamed, she arose and went to her chamber and wept. But he followed her there. She said, "Has the devil power over me? Or did my deliverer never come?" Then he struck her in the face and said, "Did thy deliverer never come? It is he who has thee in his power, thou traitor. Have I deserved this from thee?" Then he made himself visible, went into the hall, and cried, "The wedding is at an end. The true king has returned." The kings, princes, and counselors who were assembled there ridiculed and mocked him, but he did not trouble to answer them, and said, "Will you go away or not?" On this, they tried to seize him and pressed upon him, but he drew his sword and said, "All heads off but mine." And all the heads rolled on the ground, and he alone was master, and once more king of the Golden Mountain. The Raven. There was once upon a time a queen who had a little daughter who was still so young that she had to be carried. One day, the child was naughty, and the mother might say what she liked, but the child would not be quiet. Then she became impatient, and as the ravens were flying about the palace, she opened the window and said, "I wish you were a raven and would fly away, and then I should have some rest." Scarcely had she spoken the words before the child was changed into a raven and flew from her arms out of the window. It flew into a dark forest and stayed in it a long time, and the parents heard nothing of their child. Then, one day, a man was on his way through this forest and heard the raven crying, and followed the voice. And when he came nearer, the bird said, "I am a king's daughter by birth, and am bewitched, but thou canst set me free." "What am I to do?" asked he. She said, "Go further into the forest, and thou wilt find a house wherein sits an aged woman, who will offer thee meat and drink. But you must accept nothing, for if you eatest and drinkest anything, thou wilt fall into a sleep, and then thou wilt not be able to deliver me. In the garden behind the house there is a great heap of tan, and on this thou shalt stand and wait for me. For 3 days I will come every afternoon at 2 o'clock in a carriage. On the first day, 4 white horses will be harnessed to it, then 4 chestnut horses, and lastly 4 black ones. But if thou art not awake, but sleeping, I shall not be set free." The man promised to do everything that she desired, but the raven said, "Alas, I know already that thou wilt not deliver me. Thou wilt accept something from the woman." Then the man once more promised that he would certainly not touch anything, either to eat or to drink. But when he entered the house, the old woman came to him and said, "Poor man, how faint you are. Come and refresh yourself. Eat and drink." "No," said the man, "I will not eat or drink." She, however, let him have no peace, and said, "If you will not eat, take 1 drink out of the glass. 1 is nothing." Then he let himself be persuaded, and drank. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven. As he was standing there, his weariness all at once became so great that he could not struggle against it, and lay down for a short time. But he was determined not to go to sleep. Hardly, however, had he lain down, than his eyes closed of their own accord, and he fell asleep and slept so soundly that nothing in the world could have aroused him. At 2 o'clock, the raven came driving up with 4 white horses, but she was already in deep grief and said, "I know he is asleep. Go." And when she came into the garden, he was indeed lying there asleep on the heap of tan. She alighted from the carriage, went to him, shook him, and called him, but he did not awake. Next day, about noon, the old woman came again and brought him food and drink, but he would not take any of it. But she let him have no rest and persuaded him until at length he again took 1 drink out of the glass. Towards 2 o'clock, he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven, but all at once felt such a great weariness that his limbs would no longer support him. He could not help himself, and was forced to lie down, and fell into a heavy sleep. When the raven drove up with 4 brown horses, she was already full of grief, and said, "I know he is asleep." She went to him, but there he lay sleeping, and there was no wakening him. Next day, the old woman asked what was the meaning of this. He was neither eating nor drinking anything. Did he want to die? He replied, "I am not allowed to eat or drink, and will not do so." But she set a dish with food and a glass with wine before him, and when he smelt it, he could not resist, and swallowed a deep draught. When the time came, he went out into the garden to the heap of tan, and waited for the king's daughter. But he became still more weary than on the day before, and lay down and slept as soundly as if he had been a stone. At 2 o'clock, the raven came with 4 black horses, and the coachman and everything else was black. She was already in the deepest grief, and said, "I know that he is asleep and cannot deliver me." When she came to him, there he was lying fast asleep. She shook him and called him, but she could not waken him. Then she laid a loaf beside him, and after that a piece of meat, and thirdly a bottle of wine, and he might consume as much of all of them as he liked, but they would never grow less. After this, she took a gold ring from her finger and put it on his, and her name was graven on it. Lastly, she laid a letter beside him, wherein was written what she had given him, and that none of the things would ever grow less. And in it was also written, "I see right well that here you will never be able to deliver me. But if thou art still willing to deliver me, come to the golden castle of Stromberg. It lies in thy power, of that I am certain." And when she had given him all these things, she seated herself in her carriage and drove to the golden castle of Stromberg. When the man awoke and saw that he had slept, he was sad at heart and said, "She has certainly driven by, and I have not set her free." Then he perceived the things which were lying beside him, and read the letter wherein was written how everything had happened. So he arose and went away, intending to go to the golden castle of Stromberg, but he did not know where it was. After he had walked about the world for a long time, he entered into a dark forest and walked for 14 days, and still could not find his way out. Then it was once more evening, and he was so tired that he lay down in a thicket and fell asleep. Next day he went onwards, and in the evening, as he was again about to lie down beneath some bushes, he heard such a howling and crying that he could not go to sleep. And at the time when people light the candles, he saw one glimmering, and arose and went towards it. Then he came to a house which seemed very small, for in front of it a great giant was standing. He thought to himself, "If I go in, and the giant sees me, it will very likely cost me my life." At length he ventured it and went in. When the giant saw him, he said, "It is well that thou comest, for it is long since I have eaten. I will at once eat thee for my supper." "I'd rather you would leave that alone," said the man. "I do not like to be eaten. But if thou hast any desire to eat, I have quite enough here to satisfy thee." "If that be true," said the giant, "thou mayest be easy. I was only going to devour thee, because I had nothing else." Then they went, and sat down to the table, and the man took out the bread, wine, and meat, which would never come to an end. "This pleases me well," said the giant, and ate to his heart's content. Then the man said to him, "Canst thou tell me where the golden castle of Stromberg is?" The giant said, "I will look at my map. All the towns and villages and houses are to be found on it." He brought out the map which he had in the room and looked for the castle, but it was not to be found on it. "It's no matter," said he. "I have some still larger maps in my cupboard upstairs, and we will look in them." But there, too, it was in vain. The man now wanted to go onwards, but the giant begged him to wait a few days longer until his brother, who had gone out to bring some provisions, came home. When the brother came home, they inquired about the golden castle of Stromberg. He replied, "When I have eaten and have had enough, I will look in the map." Then he went with them up to his chamber, and they searched in his map, but could not find it. Then he brought out still older maps, and they never rested until they found the golden castle of Stromberg. But it was many thousand miles away. "How am I to get there?" asked the man. The giant said, "I have 2 hours' time, during which I will carry you into the neighborhood. But after that, I must be at home to suckle the child that we have." So the giant carried the man to about 100 leagues from the castle, and said, "Thou canst very well walk the rest of the way alone." And he turned back. But the man went onwards, day and night, until at length he came to the golden castle of Stromberg. It stood on a glass mountain, and the bewitched maiden drove in her carriage round the castle, and then went inside it. He rejoiced when he saw her, and wanted to climb up to her. But when he began to do so, he always slipped down the glass again. And when he saw that he could not reach her, he was filled with trouble, and said to himself, "I will stay down here below and wait for her." So he built himself a hut and stayed in it for a whole year, and every day saw the king's daughter driving about above, but never could go to her. Then, one day, he saw from his hut 3 robbers who were beating each other, and cried to them, "God be with ye." They stopped when they heard the cry, but as they saw no one, they once more began to beat each other, and that too most dangerously. So he again cried, "God be with ye." Again they stopped, looked round about, but as they saw no one, they went on beating each other. Then he cried for the 3rd time, "God be with ye," and thought, "I must see what these 3 are about," and went thither and asked why they were beating each other so furiously. One of them said that he found a stick, and that when he struck a door with it, that door would spring open. The next said that he had found a mantle, and that whenever he put it on, he was invisible. But the third said he had found a horse on which a man could ride everywhere, even up the glass mountain. And now they did not know whether they ought to have these things in common, or whether they ought to divide them. Then the man said, "I will give you something in exchange for these 3 things. Money indeed have I not, but I have other things of more value. But first, I must try yours to see if you have told the truth." Then they put him on the horse, threw the mantle round him, and gave him the stick in his hand. And when he had all these things, they were no longer able to see him. So he gave them some vigorous blows and cried, "Now, vagabonds, you have got what you deserve. Are you satisfied?" And he rode up the glass mountain. But when he came in front of the castle at the top, it was shut. Then he struck the door with his stick, and it sprang open immediately. He went in and ascended the stairs until he came to the hall where the maiden was sitting with a golden cup full of wine before her. She, however, could not see him because he had the mantle on. And when he came up to her, he drew from his finger the ring which she had given him, and threw it into the cup so that it rang. Then she cried, "That is my ring. So the man who is to set me free must be here." They searched the whole castle and did not find him, but he had gone out and had seated himself on the horse and thrown off the mantle. When they came to the door, they saw him and cried aloud in their delight. Then he alighted and took the king's daughter in his arms. But she kissed him and said, "Now hast thou set me free, and tomorrow we will celebrate our wedding." The Peasant's Wise Daughter. There was once a poor peasant who had no land, but only a small house, and one daughter. Then said the daughter, "We ought to ask our lord the king for a bit of newly cleared land." When the king heard of their poverty, he presented them with a piece of land, which she and her father dug up, and intended to sow with a little corn and grain of that kind. When they had dug nearly the whole of the field, they found in the earth a mortar made of pure gold. "Listen," said the father to the girl. "As our lord the king has been so gracious and presented us with the field, we ought to give him this mortar in return for it." The daughter, however, would not consent to this, and said, "Father, if we have the mortar without having the pestle as well, we shall have to get the pestle, so you had much better say nothing about it." He would, however, not obey her, but took the mortar and carried it to the king, said that he had found it in the cleared land, and asked if he would accept it as a present. The king took the mortar and asked if he had found nothing besides that. "No," answered the countryman. Then the king said that he must now bring him the pestle. The peasant said they had not found that, but he might just as well have spoken to the wind. He was put in prison and was to stay there until he produced the pestle. The servants had daily to carry him bread and water, which is what people get in prison. And they heard how the man cried out continually, "Ah, if I had but listened to my daughter! Alas, alas, if I had but listened to my daughter, and would neither eat nor drink." So he commanded the servants to bring the prisoner before him. And then the king asked the peasant why he was always crying. "Ah, if I had but listened to my daughter!" And what it was that his daughter had said. "She told me that I ought not to take the mortar to you, for I should have to produce the pestle as well. If you have a daughter who is as wise as that, let her come here." She was therefore obliged to appear before the king, who asked her if she really was so wise, and said he would set her a riddle, and if she could guess that, he would marry her. She at once said yes, she would guess it. Then said the king, "Come to me not clothed, not naked, not riding, not walking, not in the road, and not out of the road. And if thou canst do that, I will marry thee." So she went away, put off everything she had on, and then she was not clothed, and took a great fishing net, and seated herself in it, and wrapped it entirely round and round her, so that she was not naked. And she hired an ass, and tied the fisherman's net to its tail, so that it was forced to drag her along. And that was neither riding nor walking. The ass had also to drag her in the ruts, so that she only touched the ground with her great toe. And that was neither being in the road nor out of the road. And when she arrived in that fashion, the king said she had guessed the riddle and fulfilled all the conditions. Then he ordered her father to be released from the prison, took her to wife, and gave into her care all the royal possessions. Now, when some years had passed, the king was once drawing up his troops on parade, when it happened that some peasants who had been selling wood stopped with their wagons before the palace. Some of them had oxen yoked to them, and some horses. There was one peasant who had 3 horses, one of which was delivered of a young foal, and it ran away and lay down between 2 oxen, which were in front of the wagon. When the peasants came together, they began to dispute, to beat each other, and make a disturbance. And the peasant with the oxen wanted to keep the foal, and said one of the oxen had given birth to it, and the other said his horse had had it, and that it was his. The quarrel came before the king, and he gave the verdict that the foal should stay where it had been found. And so the peasant with the oxen, to whom it did not belong, got it. Then the other went away, and wept, and lamented over his foal. Now he had heard how gracious his lady the queen was, because she herself had sprung from poor peasant folks. So he went to her and begged her to see if she could not help him to get his foal back again. Said she, "Yes, I will tell you what to do. If thou wilt promise me not to betray me, early tomorrow morning, when the king parades the guard, place thyself there in the middle of the road by which he must pass. Take a great fishing net and pretend to be fishing. Go on fishing too, and empty out the net as if thou hadst got it full." And then she told him also what he was to say if he was questioned by the king. The next day, therefore, the peasant stood there and fished on dry ground. When the king passed by and saw that, he sent his messenger to ask what the stupid man was about. He answered, "I am fishing." The messenger asked how he could fish when there was no water there. The peasant said, "It is as easy for me to fish on dry land as it is for an ox to have a foal." The messenger went back and took the answer to the king, who ordered the peasant to be brought to him and told him that this was not his own idea. And he wanted to know whose it was. The peasant must confess this at once. The peasant, however, would not do so, and said always, "God forbid he should. The idea was his own." They laid him, however, on a heap of straw, and beat him, and tormented him so long that at last he admitted that he had got the idea from the queen. When the king reached home again, he said to his wife, "Why hast thou behaved so falsely to me? I will not have thee any longer for a wife. Thy time is up. Go back to the place from whence thou camest to thy peasant's hut." One favor, however, he granted her. She might take with her the one thing that was dearest and best in her eyes. And thus was she dismissed. She said, "Yes, my dear husband, if you command this, I will do it." And she embraced him and kissed him, and said she would take leave of him. Then she ordered a powerful sleeping draught to be brought, to drink farewell to him. The king took a long draught, but she took only a little. He soon fell into a deep sleep. And when she perceived that, she called a servant and took a fair white linen cloth and wrapped the king in it. And the servant was forced to carry him into a carriage that stood before the door. And she drove with him to her own little house. She laid him in her own little bed, and he slept one day and one night without awakening. And when he awoke, he looked round and said, "Good God, where am I?" He called his attendants, but none of them were there. At length, his wife came to his bedside and said, "My dear lord and king, you told me I might bring away with me from the palace that which was dearest and most precious in my eyes. I have nothing more precious and dear than yourself, so I have brought you with me." Tears rose to the king's eyes, and he said, "Dear wife, thou shalt be mine, and I will be thine." And he took her back with him to the royal palace, and was married again to her. And at the present time, they are very likely still living. Old Hildebrand. Once upon a time, there lived a poor peasant named Hildebrand and his wife in a little village. The parson of that place, a man sly in heart though smooth in tongue, had long cast longing glances upon the peasant's wife. Many a day had he pondered how he might spend, without fear or interruption, a whole day alone with her. The wife herself, being not unwilling, lent her ear to his plans, and thus they plotted together. At length the parson said, "Listen, my dear soul, I have devised a scheme most fitting. On Wednesday thou must take to thy bed, and feign thyself grievously ill. Tell thy husband thou art so weak that death itself seems near. Groan, lament, and hold fast till Sunday. Then, in my sermon, I will declare that whosoever has at home a sick child, a sick wife, a sick husband, father, mother, sister, brother, or any other, and makes a holy pilgrimage to the Göckerli hill in Italy, where for 1 kreutzer a sack of laurel leaves may be bought. Straightway that sick one shall be restored to health." The wife agreed at once, saying, "I shall act it out well enough." So on Wednesday she crept into bed, wrapped herself in blankets, and began her moaning. Hildebrand, poor man, bustled hither and thither, cooking, fetching, praying, doing all he could imagine, yet nothing brought her ease. By Sunday, she sighed. "I feel as though death's shadow lay on me. Only one thing would I fain do ere the end: hear the parson's sermon this day." Her husband, full of care, replied, "Nay, dearest, do not risk it. I will go and listen with all my ears, then repeat every word when I return." So Hildebrand set off to church. The parson mounted the pulpit and preached as he had devised. He spoke of healing for every manner of sickness. If only the kin would make pilgrimage to the Göckerli hill and bring back laurel leaves bought for 1 kreutzer. Whoever wished to undertake such a holy journey was to come to him after service, and he would provide both sack and coin. No man in all the congregation was more overjoyed than Hildebrand. Straight after the blessing, he hurried to the parson, received the little sack and the kreutzer, and sped home. At the very threshold he called, "Good wife, be of good cheer." The parson's words are wondrous. If I hasten to Italy and fetch the laurel, thou shalt be cured as by a miracle. Already have I the sack and the coin, so I start this hour." And without further ado, he set out. No sooner had he gone than the wife leapt from bed, shook the weariness from her limbs, and opened the door to the parson, who had tarried nearby. Together they prepared to make merry. Chickens and geese were slaughtered, pancakes fried, and soon the fiddle was sounding in the room. But let us leave them for a while and follow poor Hildebrand. He strode quickly along the road, eager to shorten the journey. Before long, he met his gossip, an egg merchant returning from market with empty baskets upon his back. "God bless thee, Hildebrand," said the gossip. "Why goest thou in such haste?" "To Italy, friend, to Italy for all eternity," cried Hildebrand breathlessly. He then repeated word for word the sermon, telling how his wife lay sick and how the parson had given him sack and kreutzer for the pilgrimage. The egg merchant shook his head. "Ah, poor simple soul, dost thou not see the trick? The parson contrived this to have thy wife alone. There is no healing laurel in Italy." Hildebrand started and turned pale. "If only I could be sure." "Then do as I say," whispered the gossip. "Creep into my egg basket. I will carry thee back to thine own house, and thine eyes shall prove the truth." So Hildebrand crouched within the basket, and his gossip bore him homeward. When they reached the cottage, all was noise and laughter within. The gossip knocked. "Who is there?" cried the woman. "'Tis I, gossip," answered the egg merchant. "I beg shelter for the night. My eggs I could not sell, and they are so heavy I can go no farther, for darkness is upon me." Though it troubled her, she opened and said, "Come in then, and sit by the stove." So the gossip entered, setting the basket down. Meanwhile, the parson fiddled merrily, and the woman clapped her hands in delight. At length he said, "Sweet friend, thou canst sing so prettily. Sing me a song." "Oh," laughed she, "in my youth I sang well, but that time is past." "Sing, I beg thee," urged he again. So she began, "I've sent my husband away from me, to the Göckerli hill in Italy." The parson struck up in answer, "I wish 'twere a year before he came back. I'd never ask him for laurel leaf sack." Hallelujah. Then, from the shadows, the gossip sang slyly, "What art thou doing, my Hildebrand dear, there on the bench by the stove, so near? Hallelujah." At that, Hildebrand himself sprang up from the basket and thundered forth, "All singing I ever shall hate from this day. And here in this basket no longer I'll stay. Hallelujah." Out he leapt, seized a cudgel, and thrashed the parson soundly, driving him from the cottage in disgrace. And thus the trickster's scheme was undone, and the wife learned never again to feign sickness at another's bidding. The water of life. There was once a king who had an illness, and no one believed that he would come out of it with his life. He had 3 sons who were much distressed about it, and went down into the palace garden and wept. There they met an old man who inquired as to the cause of their grief. They told him that their father was so ill that he would most certainly die, for nothing seemed to cure him. Then the old man said, "I know of one more remedy, and that is the water of life. If he drinks of it, he will become well again. But it is hard to find." The eldest said, "I will manage to find it," and went to the sick king, and begged to be allowed to go forth in search of the water of life, for that alone could save him. "No," said the king, "the danger of it is too great. I would rather die." But he begged so long that the king consented. The prince thought in his heart, "If I bring the water, then I shall be best beloved of my father, and shall inherit the kingdom." So he set out, and when he had ridden forth a little distance, a dwarf stood there in the road, who called to him and said, "Whither away so fast?" "Silly shrimp," said the prince, very haughtily, "it is nothing to do with you," and rode on. But the little dwarf had grown angry, and had wished an evil wish. Soon after this, the prince entered a ravine, and the further he rode, the closer the mountains drew together, and at last the road became so narrow that he could not advance a step further. It was impossible either to turn his horse or to dismount from the saddle, and he was shut in there as if in prison. The sick king waited long for him, but he came not. Then the second son said, "Father, let me go forth to seek the water," and thought to himself, "If my brother is dead, then the kingdom will fall to me." At first, the king would not allow him to go either, but at last he yielded. So the prince set out on the same road that his brother had taken, and he too met the dwarf, who stopped him to ask whither he was going in such haste. "Little shrimp," said the prince, "that is nothing to thee," and rode on without giving him another look. But the dwarf bewitched him, and he, like the other, rode into a ravine, and could neither go forwards nor backwards. So, fair, haughty people. As the second son also remained away, the youngest begged to be allowed to go forth to fetch the water, and at last the king was obliged to let him go. When he met the dwarf, and the latter asked him whither he was going in such haste, he stopped, gave him an explanation, and said, "I am seeking the water of life, for my father is sick unto death. Dost thou know then where that is to be found?" "No," said the prince, "as thou hast borne thyself as is seemly, and not haughtily like thy false brothers, I will give thee the information, and tell thee how thou mayest obtain the water of life. It springs from a fountain in the courtyard of an enchanted castle, but thou wilt not be able to make thy way to it, if I do not give thee an iron wand and 2 small loaves of bread. Strike thrice with the wand on the iron door of the castle, and it will spring open. Inside lie 2 lions with gaping jaws, but if thou throwest a loaf to each of them, they will be quieted. Then hasten to fetch some of the water of life before the clock strikes 12, else the door will shut again, and thou wilt be imprisoned." The prince thanked him, took the wand and the bread, and set out on his way. When he arrived, everything was as the dwarf had said. The door sprang open at the 3rd stroke of the wand, and when he had appeased the lions with the bread, he entered the castle and came to a large and splendid hall, wherein sat some enchanted princes whose rings he drew off their fingers. A sword and a loaf of bread were lying there, which he carried away. After this, he entered a chamber, in which was a beautiful maiden who rejoiced when she saw him, kissed him, and told him that he had delivered her, and should have the whole of her kingdom, and that if he would return in a year, their wedding should be celebrated. Likewise, she told him where the spring of the water of life was, and that he was to hasten and draw some of it before the clock struck 12. Then he went onwards, and at last entered a room where there was a beautiful, newly made bed. And as he was very weary, he felt inclined to rest a little. So he lay down and fell asleep. When he awoke, it was striking 11:45. He sprang up in a fright, ran to the spring, drew some water in a cup which stood near, and hastened away. But just as he was passing through the iron door, the clock struck 12, and the door fell to with such violence that it carried away a piece of his heel. He, however, rejoicing at having obtained the water of life, went homewards, and again passed the dwarf. When the latter saw the sword and the loaf, he said, "With these thou hast won great wealth. With the sword thou canst slay whole armies, and the bread will never come to an end." But the prince would not go home to his father without his brothers, and said, "Dear dwarf, canst thou not tell me where my 2 brothers are? They went out before I did in search of the water of life, and have not returned. They are imprisoned between 2 mountains," said the dwarf. I have condemned them to stay there because they were so haughty." Then the prince begged until the dwarf released them, but he warned him, however, and said, "Beware of them, for they have bad hearts." When his brothers came, he rejoiced and told them how things had gone with him, that he had found the water of life and had brought a cupful away with him, and had rescued a beautiful princess who was willing to wait a year for him. And then their wedding was to be celebrated, and he would obtain a great kingdom. After that, they rode on together, and chanced upon a land where war and famine reigned, and the king already thought he must perish, for the scarcity was so great. Then the prince went to him and gave him the loaf, wherewith he fed and satisfied the whole of his kingdom. And then the prince gave him the sword also, wherewith he slew the hosts of his enemies, and could now live in rest and peace. The prince then took back his loaf and his sword, and the three brothers rode on. But after this, they entered 2 more countries, where war and famine reigned. And each time the prince gave his loaf and his sword to the kings, and had now delivered 3 kingdoms. And after that, they went on board a ship and sailed over the sea. During the passage, the 2 eldest conversed apart and said, "The youngest has found the water of life, and not we. For that our Father will give him the kingdom which belongs to us, and he will rob us of all our fortune." They then began to seek revenge, and plotted with each other to destroy him. They waited until they found him fast asleep. Then they poured the water of life out of the cup, and took it for themselves. But into the cup they poured salt sea water. Now therefore, when they arrived home, the youngest took his cup to the sick king in order that he might drink out of it and be cured. But scarcely had he drunk a very little of the salt sea water, then he became still worse than before. And as he was lamenting over this, the 2 eldest brothers came and accused the youngest of having intended to poison him, and said that they had brought him the true water of life and handed it to him. He had scarcely tasted it when he felt his sickness departing, and became strong and healthy as in the days of his youth. After that, they both went to the youngest, mocked him, and said, "You certainly found the water of life, but you have had the pain, and we the gain. You should have been sharper, and should have kept your eyes open. We took it from you whilst you were asleep at sea, and when a year is over, one of us will go and fetch the beautiful princess. But beware that you do not disclose aught of this to our father. Indeed, he does not trust you. And if you say a single word, you shall lose your life into the bargain. But if you keep silent, you shall have it as a gift." The old king was angry with his youngest son and thought he had plotted against his life. So he summoned the court together and had sentence pronounced upon his son that he should be secretly shot. And once when the prince was riding forth to the chase, suspecting no evil, the king's huntsman had to go with him. And when they were quite alone in the forest, the huntsman looked so sorrowful that the prince said to him, "Dear huntsman, what ails you?" The huntsman said, "I cannot tell you, and yet I ought." Then the prince said, "Say openly what it is. I will pardon you." "Alas," said the huntsman, "I am to shoot you dead. The king has ordered me to do it." Then the prince was shocked and said, "Dear huntsman, let me live. There I give you my royal garments. Give me your common ones in their stead." The huntsman said, "I will willingly do that. Indeed, I should not have been able to shoot you." Then they exchanged clothes, and the huntsman returned home. The prince, however, went further into the forest. After a time, 3 wagons of gold and precious stones came to the king for his youngest son, which were sent by the 3 kings who had slain their enemies with the prince's sword, and maintained their people with his bread, and who wished to show their gratitude for it. The old king then thought, "Can my son have been innocent?" and said to his people, "Would that he were still alive! How it grieves me that I have suffered him to be killed." "He still lives," said the huntsman. "I could not find it in my heart to carry out your command," and told the king how it had happened. Then a stone fell from the king's heart, and he had it proclaimed in every country that his son might return and be taken into favor again. The princess, however, had a road made up to her palace, which was quite bright and golden, and told her people that whosoever came riding straight along it to her would be the right wooer, and was to be admitted, and whoever rode by the side of it was not the right one, and was not to be admitted. As the time was now close at hand, the eldest thought he would hasten to go to the king's daughter, and give himself out as her deliverer, and thus win her for his bride, and the kingdom to boot. Therefore he rode forth, and when he arrived in front of the palace and saw the splendid golden road, he thought it would be a sin and a shame if he were to ride over that, and turned aside and rode on the right side of it. But when he came to the door, the servants told him that he was not the right man, and was to go away again. Soon after this, the second prince set out, and when he came to the golden road, and his horse had put 1 foot on it, he thought it would be a sin and a shame to tread a piece of it off, and he turned aside and rode on the left side of it. And when he reached the door, the attendants told him he was not the right one, and he was to go away again. When at last the year had entirely expired, the third son likewise wished to ride out of the forest to his beloved, and with her forget his sorrows. So he set out, and thought of her so incessantly, and wished to be with her so much that he never noticed the golden road at all. So his horse rode onwards up the middle of it, and when he came to the door, it was opened, and the princess received him with joy, and said he was her deliverer, and lord of the kingdom, and their wedding was celebrated with great rejoicing. When it was over, she told him that his father invited him to come to him, and had forgiven him. So he rode thither, and told him everything, how his brothers had betrayed him, and how he had nevertheless kept silence. The old king wished to punish them, but they had put to sea, and never came back as long as they lived. Dr. Know-All. There was once, long ago, a poor peasant by the name of Crab. Day after day, he toiled in the fields and the forest, and all that he owned in the world were 2 sturdy oxen, his wooden cart, and a patched-up coat to cover his back. One morning, when the sun was low and the mist still hung in the valleys, he yoked his oxen and loaded his cart with a heavy pile of firewood. With slow steps, he drove into town, hoping to earn a few coins for his labor. At length, he stopped before the house of a wealthy doctor, who bought the whole load for 2 shining thalers. The doctor happened to be seated at table, eating his midday meal. There were fine dishes before him, meat seasoned with herbs, golden wine in crystal glasses, and servants waiting on his every word. Crab, with his cracked hands still sticky with resin, gazed upon the scene with wonder. His heart began to burn with envy, and he thought to himself, how good it must be to live as such a man, not to chop wood, not to drive weary oxen, but to sit in comfort, eat like a lord, and be called a man of knowledge. Oh, if only I too could be a doctor. The desire grew stronger the longer he looked, until he could no longer contain it. He cleared his throat and said rather shyly, Sir Doctor, might a poor fellow like me ever become a doctor also? The doctor, amused by the simplicity of the question, smiled and answered, Why, yes, indeed. That is not so hard as you think. Crab's eyes lit up. And what must I do? He asked eagerly. The doctor, wishing to make sport of him, said, First, you must buy yourself an ABC book, one that has a cock painted on the first page. Second, you must sell your cart and your oxen, and with the money, get fine clothes and such things as belong to the trade of medicine. Third, you must have a sign painted on which stand the words, "I am Dr. Know-all." Nail that over your house door, and people will believe you are wise. Crab, simple though he was, believed every word. He went at once and did exactly as he had been told. He sold his oxen and cart, bought himself a bright coat, a feathered hat, and the book with the cock upon it. He hung above his door the sign that read in bold letters, "I am Dr. Know-all." Thus he became a doctor, at least in name. It was not long before people began to come to him, asking for help. And though Crab had no knowledge at all, fortune seemed to smile upon his foolish answers. After a little while, news reached a certain great lord. This lord had been robbed of a large sum of money, and he was eager to find the thief. His servants told him of a doctor in a nearby village, one called Dr. Know-all, who surely, by his very name, must know the secret. Without delay, the Lord ordered his carriage, with 6 horses harnessed to it, and drove out to Crab's cottage. He asked at once, "Are you Dr. Know-all?" "Yes, that I am," answered Crab, puffing out his chest. "Then you must come with me and discover who has stolen my treasure." Crab scratched his head and said, "Oh yes, my lord. But my wife Greta must come as well." The lord consented, and so Crab and his wife climbed into the splendid carriage, marveling at the velvet cushions, and away they rode to the castle. There, the tables were already laid with silver plates and golden cups, for the Lord wished to treat his guest with honor. "Sit down and eat, doctor," said he. "Yes, but Greta too," replied Crab, and he seated himself at her side. They were served the choicest dishes. Now it so happened that the servants who had stolen the money were the very ones carrying the food. The first servant entered with a dish, and Crab, meaning only to whisper to his wife, nudged her and said, "Greta, that is the first." By this he meant the first course, but the servant, pale with guilt, thought he meant, "That is the first thief." Terrified, he hurried outside and told the others, "The doctor knows everything. He said it was the first." The second servant, trembling, brought in his dish. Again Crab nudged his wife and said, "Greta, that is the second." The servant turned as white as milk, fled the room, and gasped to his comrades, "We are lost. He knows I am the second." The third fared no better, for Crab repeated the same words, and again the servant believed himself discovered. At last, the fourth servant entered with a covered dish. The Lord turned to Crab and said, "Now, doctor, show me your wisdom. Tell me what lies beneath this cover." Crab stared at the dish. He had no idea for he was no more a doctor than an ox. In his helplessness, he sighed and muttered under his breath, "Ah, poor crab." The Lord leapt up, clapping his hands. "There, did I not say so? He has named the thief himself, Crab. That is the very fellow who stole the money." The guilty servants grew pale as ashes. They feared they were undone, and quickly signaled to Crab that he should follow them outside. Trembling, he obeyed. Once beyond the hall, they fell on their knees before him and confessed all. "Good doctor, we have indeed taken the treasure. Only spare us, and we will bring it back. And moreover, give you a heavy purse besides." Crab nodded solemnly, as if this were the very thing he had foreseen. They led him to the hiding place, gave him the gold, and begged for silence. Crab agreed readily, for he was more than content with his reward. Returning to the hall, he sat down once more and said gravely, "My lord, I shall now consult my book to see where the money is concealed." He opened his ABC book, turned the pages this way and that, searching for the cock upon the frontispiece. Meanwhile, the fifth servant, burning with curiosity, crept into the stove to overhear what might be revealed. Crab, unable to find the picture at once, shook his head and said aloud, "I know you are here, so you may as well come out." The servant in the stove thought himself discovered, leapt out in terror, and cried, "Indeed, this man knows everything." So Dr. Know-all returned the treasure to the Lord, who marveled at his wisdom. Yet he did not betray the guilty, but kept their secret. From the Lord he received rich thanks, and from the servants an even greater reward. Thus he became both wealthy and renowned, and all the people of the land believed that truly there was none wiser than Dr. Know-all. The Spirit in the Glass Bottle. Once, in a quiet village where the roofs smoked gently in the early morning, and the woods lay dark and deep beyond the fields, there lived a poor woodcutter. His hands were hard as oak bark, and his back bent daily beneath the burden of labor. From dawn until the last light faded from the sky, he swung his axe, splitting logs for those wealthier than himself. Though his life was filled with toil, his heart carried a single treasure, his only son. For many years, the woodcutter set aside a few coins whenever he could, denying himself comforts so that the boy might grow into something more than a mere hewer of wood. At last, when the small bag of money jingled with the weight of his long sacrifice, he called his son and said, "My child, you are all I have in this world. The sweat of my brow, the calluses of my hands, These I gladly give to you. Go forth and learn an honest trade. Fill your head with knowledge, so that when my limbs are too stiff to carry me to the forest, and my eyes are too dim to guide the axe, you may sustain me in my old age. The boy, whose heart was tender and eager, obeyed. He went away to a university where towers rose high and bells tolled the hours of study. He bent himself earnestly to his lessons. His teachers, wise men with books heavy as stones, praised his diligence, and in time the boy began to shine among his peers. Yet learning is like a vast forest. One may walk long paths and still see only the edge of its mysteries. Before he could master all the arts, the small store of his father's money was gone, as a brook runs dry in summer. With a heavy heart, the son returned to his humble home. The father, seeing him, shook his head in sorrow. Alas, my boy, I can give no more. These are hard days. My hands can scarcely earn us bread, let alone your schooling. But the son laid a hand upon his father's shoulder and spoke gently. Do not grieve, dear father. If it is God's will, all shall yet be well. What is written for me will come to pass. I will not fall into despair. The next morning, as the father prepared to go into the woods with his single axe, the son declared, I will go with you, father, and share the work. The father frowned. No, my son, you are not hardened to such labor. Your hands are made for books, not for rough timber. And besides, I have but one axe. I cannot buy another. Then ask our neighbor, replied the boy. He will lend his axe until I have earned enough to buy my own. So the father, though doubtful, borrowed an axe, and together they set out at dawn. The forest greeted them with mist and birdsong. The son worked beside his father with cheerful spirit, though his strokes were clumsy compared to the old man's seasoned blows. By noon, when the sun blazed high above the trees, the father sank wearily upon a log and said, Let us rest now, eat our bread, and gather strength for the afternoon. But the son laughed lightly. Rest if you wish, father. I am not yet tired. I will wander a little and look for birds' nests among the branches. You foolish boy, muttered the father. Idle wandering will sap your strength. Then you will be too weary to help me. Yet the son only smiled, slung his crust of bread in his hand, and went off into the green shade. He walked long beneath the rustling canopy, delighting in the whisper of leaves. At last, he came to a mighty oak, so vast that 5 strong men could not have encircled its trunk. The roots curled from the earth like ancient serpents, and the branches towered like a cathedral roof. Surely, thought the boy. Many a bird has nested in such a tree. As he gazed upward, he suddenly heard a muffled cry. "Let me out! Oh, let me out!" Startled, he turned about, but no one was there. Again came the cry, low and strained, as though from the very ground. He bent down and called, "Where are you?" The voice answered faintly, "Here, among the oak's roots. Release me." Curious and without fear, the student scratched away the soil. There, hidden in a hollow, he found a glass bottle. Something leapt inside it, like a frog, knocking against the sides. Again came the cry, "Let me out!" Thinking no harm, the youth drew out the cork. In an instant, a dark vapor poured forth, twisting and swelling until a monstrous spirit towered before him, half as tall as the ancient oak. The earth trembled beneath its weight, and its voice roared like a storm. "Do you know your reward for freeing me?" The boy, though trembling inwardly, kept his face calm. "No, indeed. What reward do you mean?" "Your reward is death," thundered the spirit. "I must break your neck." "Had I known such was the thanks I should receive," said the lad coolly, "I would have left you in your prison. But my head shall not be forfeit so quickly. Let others be consulted." "Others or none," bellowed the spirit. "You are mine. Long centuries have I lain imprisoned. This was no gift but punishment. I am the mighty Mercurius, and he who sets me free must die." "Not so fast," answered the boy. "How am I to know you truly came from so small a bottle? Prove it. Enter again, and then I will believe your tale. After that, you may do with me as you will." In his pride, the spirit sneered. A simple trick, and he shrank, twisting and dwindling, until once more he slipped into the narrow glass. The instant he had done so, the clever student clapped the cork back and thrust the bottle into the roots. The spirit raged within, but his prison held him fast. The boy turned to go, but the voice cried again, this time piteous and pleading. "Let me out, kind youth, let me out, and I will grant you riches beyond measure." "Never again," said the boy. "Once you sought my life, why should I trust you?" "Have mercy," begged the spirit. "I swear no harm shall befall you. Rather, I will bestow gifts greater than gold." The youth pondered. Perhaps fortune favors the bold. "Very well, I shall try you once more." He drew the cork, and the spirit rose, vast as before. Yet instead of striking the boy down, he placed in his hands a little strip of rag, plain as a scrap from a beggar's coat. "This is your reward," said Mercurius. "With one end, touch any wound, and it will heal. With the other, touch iron or steel, and it shall become silver." Eager to test, the student gashed the bark of a tree with his axe, rubbed it with the cloth, and behold, the wound closed as if it had never been cut. Satisfied, he bowed. "We are quits. Farewell." When he returned, his father scolded, "Idle boy, you ran off and left the work undone." "Be patient, father. I will make it right." He rubbed the borrowed axe with the cloth and struck a mighty blow. But alas, the iron had turned to silver, and the blade bent like lead. The father wrung his hands. "What mischief is this? Now I must pay for the ruined axe, and I have nothing left." "Do not fret," said the son. "I will see to it." And he carried the silver axe into town, where a goldsmith weighed it and declared, "This is worth 400 talers, though I cannot pay all at once." He gave 300 on the spot and promised the rest later. The youth returned and pressed 100 talers into his father's hands. "Here, father, you shall want for nothing." The old man gaped. "Child, where did you find such treasure?" So the son told him the tale of the spirit and the gift. With the rest of the money, he returned to the university. And because he could heal all wounds with his miraculous rag, he soon became the most famous doctor in all the world. And his father, who had once feared poverty in his old age, lived out his days in comfort and honor, blessing the wisdom and courage of his son. The devil's sooty brother. Once there was a soldier who had served his king bravely in war. But when peace returned, he was sent away without pay or pension, and he wandered about with nothing in his pockets, no roof to shelter under, and no one to call a friend. He had neither bread to eat nor coin to buy it, and his boots were worn thin from endless miles of wandering. One morning, when hunger gnawed at his stomach like a wolf, and sorrow pressed heavy on his heart, he stumbled into a forest, hoping to find at least some berries or roots to keep himself alive. After walking a short while, he met a small man upon the path. Though the man's cloak was neat, and his eyes gleamed like coals, there was something uncanny about him, for he was no ordinary traveler, but the devil himself in disguise. "What troubles you so deeply, good fellow?" asked the little man with feigned kindness. The soldier sighed and said, "I am starving, yet I have not a penny left in the world." The devil grinned. "If you will serve me faithfully, you shall want for nothing all your days. You need only spend 7 years in my employ, and when the time is past, you shall go free again. You shall be clothed and fed as much as you wish, and wealth will be yours besides. But mark this well. You must not wash your body, nor comb your hair, nor cut your beard or nails, nor even wipe the tears from your eyes. If you can endure such filth for 7 years, your fortune will be made. The soldier thought to himself, better 7 years dirty than a lifetime starving. Aloud, he answered, if there is no other way, so be it. So the devil led him down beneath the earth, through passages black as coal, until they came to the heart of hell. There the soldier was shown his duties. He must tend the great kettles where the hell broth boiled and bubbled, keep the floors swept, and drive all the dirt behind the doors. But above all else, he was forbidden to lift the lids of the kettles. Do so, warned the devil, and it will go ill with you. The soldier promised obedience and began his work. He stoked the fire with logs, swept the dirt into heaps, and shoved it neatly out of sight. When the devil returned from his wanderings, he inspected the work, found it to his liking, and went off again. Yet curiosity gnawed at the soldier's heart. All around him stood great iron cauldrons, bubbling and hissing, as though they held secrets too dreadful to name. At last, he could resist no longer. He raised the lid of the first kettle and peered in. There sat his old corporal from the army, boiling in the broth. "Ah, old bird," cried the soldier, "so now you are in the pot who once lorded it over me. Now I am the master." He dropped the lid, shoved another log beneath the cauldron, and laughed grimly. Then he stole to the second kettle. Lifting the lid, he saw his former ensign writhing within. "Ha! Another old bird caught fast. Once you commanded me. Now I stoke the fire beneath you." He closed the lid with a bang and made the flames leap higher. In the third kettle, he found none other than a general who had once ordered him about with scorn. "Aha, old bird, so even generals may stew. You once had me at your mercy, but now the fire is mine to command." With that, he fetched the bellows and blew until the cauldron roared like a furnace. Thus the soldier served his 7 years in hell, blackened with soot, his hair and beard uncut, his nails like talons, and his eyes red from unwiped tears. Yet the time passed so strangely that he thought it but half a year. When the 7 years ended, the devil returned. "Well, Hans, how have you fared?" "I have stoked the fires faithfully, and swept the dirt behind the doors as you bawed," answered the soldier. The devil's eyes narrowed. "But you have also peeped into the kettles. Fortune favors you only because you added fresh logs to the fires, else you would have paid dearly. Still, your time is ended. Will you return to the world?" "Yes," said Hans, "for I long to see my father's house again." "Then take your wages," said the devil. He ordered Hans to fill his knapsack with sweepings and warned him, "Go forth as you are, unwashed, uncombed, with your long beard and nails and dim eyes. When men ask whence you come, say, 'From hell.' When they ask your name, say, 'I am the devil's sooty brother, and his king as well.'" Hans obeyed, though his heart was heavy, for he thought such wages poor reward. Yet when he reached the forest above, he opened his knapsack, and behold, the sweepings had turned to purest gold. "Never would I have believed it," he murmured, and went joyfully on his way. Coming to a town, he stopped at an inn, but when the landlord saw his frightful figure, hair like brambles, beard like moss, nails like claws, and eyes rimmed in red, he shrank back in horror. "Whence comest thou?" asked the landlord. "From hell," Hans replied. "And who art thou?" "The devil's sooty brother, and his king as well." The landlord would have barred the door, but when Hans opened his knapsack and showed the glittering gold, greed overcame fear. He welcomed him in, gave him the finest room, and set food and drink before him. Hans ate well, yet still did not wash or comb himself, as the devil had commanded. At length he lay down to sleep, while the landlord's covetous eyes remained fixed on the knapsack. In the night he crept in and stole it. At dawn, Hans rose, wishing to pay his reckoning and continue his travels. But the knapsack was gone. Though his heart sank, he said to himself, "It was not my fault. Misfortune has struck me unfairly." So he returned to hell and told the devil his plight. The devil washed him clean, trimmed his hair and nails, and wiped his eyes until he looked like a new man. Then he gave him back the knapsack, filled again with sweepings, and said, "Go and demand your gold of the landlord. If he will not return it, tell him I shall fetch him myself, and he shall poke the fires in your stead." Hans went to the inn and said sternly, "You have stolen my gold. Restore it at once, or else you shall go to hell in my place and look as foul as I once did." The landlord, pale with terror, returned not only the gold, but more besides, begging Hans to keep the matter secret. So Hans grew rich. He set out for his father's home, clad himself in a shabby smock to travel unnoticed, and played music as he went, for during his years in hell, he had learned that art. In that land, there was an old king who heard Hans play and was so delighted that he promised him his eldest daughter in marriage. But when the princess learned she was to wed a man in a rough smock frock, she declared, "I would sooner sink to the bottom of the sea." So the king gave him his youngest daughter instead, who gladly obeyed her father's will. Thus, the devil's sooty brother gained a princess for his bride, and when the aged king died, he inherited the kingdom itself. And so it came to pass that the ragged soldier, who once had nothing, became a mighty king. For even the devil's wages, though strange and grim, may bring fortune to those who endure. Bearskin. Once, long ago, in a land of war and wandering, there lived a young fellow of sturdy frame and steadfast heart. He had gone to serve as a soldier, and from the first day he bore himself with a courage that startled even his comrades. When bullets whistled and iron rained down like hail from a blackened sky, he was always foremost, his musket steady, his eyes bright and unafraid. Through long marches and bitter winters he endured, and so long as the war raged, his life had shape and meaning. The clang of swords and the roll of drums were his daily bread. But wars, like storms, do not last forever. Peace was declared at last, and with the silence of the cannons came dismissal. The captain called him, clapped him on the shoulder, and said, "You have served bravely, lad. Now go where you will." The young man bowed, but his heart sank. His parents were dead, his childhood home sold. No hearth, no roof, no kin awaited him. He turned, therefore, to his brothers, hoping that blood would be warmer than strangers' hearts. "Keep me with you until war comes again," he begged. But his brothers were hard and close-fisted. "What can we do with thee?" they said. "Thou art of no use. Go make a living for thyself." Their words were like cold iron. The door closed upon him. He had nothing left but his old musket. He slung it over his shoulder and went forth into the world, his boots thin, his stomach empty. He wandered across a wide, wind-beaten heath, where only a ring of twisted trees broke the horizon. Beneath them he sat, heavy with grief, and spoke to himself. "I have no coin," he murmured. "I have learned no craft but that of war. And now they have made peace. None wants me. I see before me hunger, and misery. As he sat thus, lost in thought, a rustling stirred the leaves. He looked up, and before him stood a stranger clad in a rich green coat, his face stately yet strange, and his foot, when it peeped from beneath the hem, was cloven like a goat's. "I know already what thou art in need of," said the man, in a voice smooth as silk and deep as a cavern. "Gold and possessions shalt thou have, as much as thou canst spend. Do what thou wilt. But first I must know if thou art fearless, for I bestow my gifts not in vain." "A soldier and fear, how can those two things go together?" cried the young man. "Put me to the proof." "Very well," answered the stranger. "Look behind thee." The soldier turned. Out from the scrub lumbered a bear, huge and shaggy, growling so that the earth trembled. "Oh-ho!" shouted the soldier. "I'll tickle thy muzzle, so thou shalt lose thy fancy for growling." He leveled his musket, fired, and the beast fell with a crash and stirred no more. "I see," said the stranger, nodding slowly, "that thou art not lacking in courage, but another condition thou must fulfill." "If it endanger not my salvation," replied the soldier, whose blood chilled a little, for he knew well who stood before him, "then I am willing. If it does, I'll have nothing to do with it." "Thou shalt look to that thyself," said the green coat. "For the next 7 years thou shalt neither wash thyself, nor comb thy hair or beard, nor cut thy nails, nor utter a single paternoster. In return, I will give thee a coat and a cloak which thou must wear. If thou diest within the 7 years, thou art mine. If thou livest, thou art free, and rich for all thy days." The soldier thought of his emptiness, of nights without bread, of his long comradeship with death in the field. He clenched his jaw, looked the stranger in the eye, and agreed. The devil, for such he was, slipped off his green coat and held it forth. "If thou wearest this coat," he said, "and puttest thy hand into the pocket, thou wilt always find it full of money." Then he stripped the hide from the fallen bear. "This shall be thy cloak and thy bed. On it shalt thou sleep, and in no other bed shalt thou lie. Because of it, men shall call thee Bearskin." And with that, the devil vanished like mist. The soldier drew on the green coat and felt in the pocket. Gold clinked there in heaps. He wrapped himself in the bearskin, rose, and went into the world. He refrained from nothing that pleased him, though his purse groaned, and yet he gave freely to the poor, that they might pray for his life during the 7 dread years. In the first year, his appearance was tolerable. In the second, he began to look monstrous. His hair and beard matted into a wild mane, his fingers hooked like claws, his skin so thick with grime that, as folk said, cress might sprout upon it. People fled at his coming, yet because he paid richly, and because his alms bought prayers, doors opened to him, even as faces turned away. In the 4th year, he came to an inn. The host, seeing him, would give neither bed nor stall, fearing his horses would be frightened. But Bearskin's hand plunged into his pocket and came up with ducats. The host relented and put him in a lonely outhouse, extracting a promise that no guest should see him, lest the inn gain a bad name. That evening, Bearskin sat alone, longing from the bottom of his heart for the 7 years to pass. Through the thin wall, he heard loud weeping. His heart, though buried under filth and fur, was still compassionate. He opened the door. Inside was an old man, gray-headed and trembling, wringing his hands. At sight of Bearskin, he shrank back in terror, but the soldier spoke gently, and at last the man listened. "My fortune has dwindled away," the old man confessed. "My 3 daughters and I must starve. I am so poor I cannot pay the innkeeper, and am to be cast into prison." "If that be all," said Bearskin, "I have gold enough." He summoned the innkeeper, paid every farthing, and pressed a purse full of coins into the old man's hand. The old man, astonished and overjoyed, said, "Come with me. My daughters are each a marvel of beauty. Choose one for thy wife. When she hears what thou hast done, she will not refuse thee. Thou dost indeed look strange, but she will set thee right again." Bearskin went. When the eldest saw him, she shrieked and fled. The second gazed and said, "How can I wed one who has lost his human form? The shaven bear that once came here in a hussar's coat pleased me more, for at least it wore gloves. If it were only ugliness, I might grow used to it." But the youngest said softly, "Dear father, he must be a good man to help you thus. If you have promised him a bride, the promise must be kept." It was pity that Bearskin's face was hidden under hair and grime, else they might have seen his joy. He drew a ring from his finger, broke it, and gave her 1/2, keeping the other. He wrote his name on her piece, and hers on his. "Keep it well," he said. "I must wander 3 years more. If I return not, thou art free, for I shall be dead. Pray God to preserve my life." The poor betrothed dressed herself all in black and wept often. Her sisters mocked her. "Beware, if thou givest him thy hand, he will strike his claws into it. Bears like sweet things, he will eat thee up." Thou must do always as he likes, or he will growl. But at least the wedding will be merry, for bears dance well." She bore their jeers in silence. Meanwhile, Bearskin roamed the world, doing good where he might, scattering gold so the poor would pray for him. At last, the final day of the 7th year dawned. He went again to the heath and sat beneath the circle of trees. The wind whistled, and the devil appeared, scowling. He flung Bearskin the old coat. "Give me back mine," he demanded. "We have not come so far," said Bearskin. "First, make me clean." Whether he liked it or not, the devil fetched water, washed Bearskin, combed his hair, and cut his nails. When he was done, the soldier stood handsome and brave, fairer than he had ever been. Light-hearted, Bearskin went into the town, donned a velvet coat, seated himself in a carriage with 4 white horses, and drove to his bride's house. None knew him. The father took him for a great general and seated him between his 2 eldest daughters. They poured his wine and gave him the choicest meats, thinking never had they seen a handsomer man. The youngest sat opposite in her black dress, eyes cast down, silent. At length, he asked the father for one of his daughters. The 2 eldest hurried away to deck themselves, each believing she was the chosen one. The stranger, alone with the youngest, dropped his half-ring into a glass of wine and handed it to her. She drank, saw the ring at the bottom, and trembled. She drew forth her own half, worn on a ribbon about her neck. The pieces fitted perfectly. "I am thy bridegroom," said he softly, "whom thou sawest as Bearskin. By God's grace, I am a man again." He took her in his arms and kissed her. When the sisters returned in their finery and learned the truth, rage and envy seized them. One threw herself into the well, the other hanged herself upon a tree. That evening, a knock sounded. The bridegroom opened the door, and there stood the devil in his green coat. He smiled with his teeth. "Seest thou?" he said. "I have now 2 souls in the place of thy one." And he vanished into the night. Thus ended the tale of Bearskin, who risked filth and shame for 7 years, yet by steadfastness, almsgiving, and the mercy of God came forth clean, rich, and blessed. The Willow-Wren and the Bear. Once, in the full warmth of summer, when the trees rustled with green and the air was heavy with the hum of bees, the bear and the wolf were walking side by side through the forest. The bear lifted his head, for from a thicket came the sweetest song he had ever heard. The notes rose clear and high, then sank soft and low, like silver threads of music, weaving through the branches. "Brother Wolf," said the bear, halting and pricking up his ears, "what bird is it that sings so wondrously well? Never have I heard such a melody." "That," said the wolf, with great seriousness, "is none other than the king of all birds. Before him, every creature of the wood must bow down, for he is Lord of the air." Yet in truth, it was but the little willow-wren, small and brown, who sat upon a twig and sang as his kind always sang. "If that be so," said the bear, his eyes gleaming with curiosity, "then I would very much like to behold this king's palace. Come, brother, take me thither, for I must see with my own eyes the dwelling of so noble a monarch." But the wolf shook his head. "It cannot be done in such haste, old growler. We must wait until the queen herself arrives, for one does not march unbidden into royal halls." Not long after, the queen of the willow-wrens indeed appeared, flitting swiftly with a morsel in her beak. Behind her came the king, and together they fed their young ones, hidden in a hole of the tree. The bear's paws itched to stride forward, but again the wolf tugged him back by the sleeve of his shaggy coat. "Patience," whispered the wolf. "We must wait until the lord and lady are gone, else we show disrespect." So they stood still and watched until the birds had flown off. Only then did the bear lumber near, thrust his great snout into the hole, and peer within. There he saw not a grand palace, nor gold, nor precious stones, but a poor little nest lined with moss and feathers, where 5 or 6 downy chicks lay stretching their thin necks. "Is this the royal palace?" cried the bear, with a loud laugh that shook his belly. "A wretched hovel it is. And you, you are no king's children, but ragged, common brats." At these words, the nestlings bristled with fury. Their tiny wings quivered, their beaks opened wide, and they cried shrilly, "That we are not. Our parents are honest and honorable folk. Bear, thou wilt have to answer for this insult, and dearly pay for it." The bear grumbled uneasily and drew back, and the wolf too felt troubled in his heart. They slunk away into the shadows, yet the young willow-wrens did not cease their clamoring. When next the king and queen returned with food, the little ones turned their heads aside and wailed, "We will not eat. No, not so much as a fly's leg, though we starve with hunger, until you have proved to us that we are indeed respectable children. The bear has been here and has mocked us." The old king ruffled his feathers, and his eyes flashed with anger. "Be easy, my children," said he, "for justice shall be done. That coarse beast shall be punished." Straightway, the king and queen flew to the bear's den and called within, "Old growler, why hast thou brought shame upon our nest and insulted our young? For this thou shalt suffer. We declare war upon thee, a war of blood and feathers." The news spread swiftly through wood and meadow. The bear summoned all the four-footed creatures, the ox with his heavy horns, the ass with his long ears, the nimble deer, the fleet hare, and every beast that ran upon the earth. Each was commanded to join the cause of the bear. Meanwhile, the Willow-Wren called forth every creature that had wings, not only the proud falcons and wise owls, the starlings and sparrows, but also the smallest midges, the hornets armed with stings, the bees from their hives, and even the flies that swarmed in summer heat. The sky grew dark with their numbers. Now, before the battle, the Willow-Wren sent out spies to learn who led the enemy host. The gnat, who was small and crafty, flew into the forest where the beasts were gathered. She crept beneath the leaf of a tree where she could hear their counsel. There the bear stood like a mountain, and he summoned the fox before him. "Fox," said the bear, "thou art the slyest of all beasts. Thou shalt be our commander." "Good," said the fox, curling his red tail proudly. "But what sign shall we agree upon, so that all may know when to charge and when to flee?" None could answer. Then the fox said, "Behold my tail. It is long and bushy, and when I hold it high aloft, like a plume of red feathers, then all goes well, and you must press forward. But when it droops low, then the battle is lost, and you must run with all speed." The gnat, having heard every word, flew swiftly back and told the Willow-Wren all in great detail. At dawn, the armies gathered. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves and paws, and the sky hummed and swarmed with wings. The Willow-Wren gave his command, and down flew the hornet, straight beneath the fox's tail. With all his might, he stung once. The fox yelped, lifting one leg, but bore it and kept his tail high. At the second sting, he winced sorely and let the tail fall for but a moment. At the third sting, he could endure no more. With a cry, he clamped his tail between his legs. When the beasts saw this, they thought the signal given for defeat. Terror seized them, and they fled each to his hole, leaving the field to the birds. Thus, the hosts of the air triumphed, and the beasts were scattered. Then the king and queen flew home with joy to their children. "Rejoice, little ones," they cried. "The battle is won. Eat and drink to your heart's desire." But the nestlings shook their heads. No feast for us until the bear himself comes to our nest and begs pardon, confessing before our eyes that we are honorable children. So the willow-wren flew again to the bear's cave and called sternly, "Growler, creep forth, and humble thyself before my brood, else every rib in thy body shall be broken." The bear, trembling with fear, came forth, lumbered to the nest, and bowed his head low. With a groan, he begged the pardon of the chicks, confessing their worth. Only then did the young wrens clap their wings, laugh, and eat greedily, making merry far into the night. And so it was proven that even the smallest may win honor when they stand together, and that prideful words, once spoken, must one day be answered.